I will be the first to admit that I am one of the most skeptical people you will ever meet. I do not believe in ghosts, I do not believe in the paranormal, and I certainly do not believe in any kind of supernatural nonsense. Whenever I hear people telling stories about haunted houses, unexplained noises, or mysterious figures in the dark, I am always the first person to roll my eyes. I am quick to dismiss those stories as completely fake, or at the very least, highly exaggerated. I always look for a logical scientific explanation for everything, but today I am completely at a loss for words. What happened to me just a few weeks ago has shaken me to my very core. I wanted to write all of this down while it was still incredibly fresh in my mind, because to be honest, I am still absolutely terrified. I cannot explain what happened to me. I keep replaying the events over and over in my head, searching for some kind of rational explanation. But I cannot find one. I thought to myself, maybe if I write down exactly what happened and share it with the internet, someone out there might be able to explain it. Maybe someone has gone through the exact same thing. Well, I certainly hope so, because I am losing sleep over this. It all started when my close friend Steve and his wife Sarah decided to plan a weekend trip. It was their wedding anniversary, and they wanted to go out of town to celebrate. The two of them do not get to travel alone very often, because their lives are incredibly busy. They have two school-aged children and a large dog, so coordinating a trip is usually a logistical nightmare. I know for some people, complaining about not being able to travel is a first-world problem, and you would be correct. But Steve is not struggling financially at all. In fact, he is quite wealthy. He built this massive, beautiful custom home out in the middle of nowhere. He chose a remote, heavily wooded area because he absolutely loves his privacy. And honestly, if you are fortunate enough to have the means to build your dream home in the quiet woods, I cannot blame you for doing it. Well, for Steve and Sarah, the stars were about to align perfectly for their anniversary weekend. Their two kids were scheduled to go out of town on a school-sponsored trip, which meant the house would be empty except for their dog. When Steve told me about this, I immediately insisted on going over to watch the dog for the weekend. I told him that he and Sarah deserved a romantic getaway without having to worry about a thing. I offered to stay at their house so their dog would not have to go to a boarding kennel. Steve was incredibly grateful, and the plan was officially set in stone. I would be spending my weekend pet-sitting their beautiful golden retriever Buster. I made my way out to Steve's house on Friday afternoon. Since I do not work on weekends, my plan was to arrive on Friday and stay all the way through Sunday evening. When I arrived, I was amazed at how much effort Steve had put into making sure I was comfortable. He had stocked the entire kitchen with high-end food, snacks, and drinks. He had bought practically every kind of snack I liked, and he even left a detailed list of instructions for the television remote and the smart home features. It was honestly complete overkill for a simple weekend pet-sitting job, but I certainly was not complaining. I love dogs, and I love having a quiet, peaceful weekend to myself, so this was a massive win-win situation for me. Now this is where the story takes a very scary turn. On Friday night, Buster and I just hung out on the couch. We watched a couple of movies, and I ordered some food. It was an incredibly relaxing evening. Around 9 o'clock that night, my phone buzzed. It was a text message from Steve. The text said, "Do not get scared being all alone in that massive house. It can get pretty spooky out there at night when you are by yourself." I read the text, smiled, and sent him a single text back that just said, "LOL." I told him to shut up and enjoy his anniversary. As I mentioned before, I am a very skeptical, grounded person. I do not get scared of being alone in empty houses, and being in the middle of the woods does not bother me in the slightest. I am well aware that anything can happen in this world, but I just do not scare easily. Buster and I eventually decided to head to bed around 1 o'clock in the morning. I was sleeping in the guest bedroom on the second floor, and Buster decided to follow me and sleep on the floor right next to the bed. I fell asleep quickly, feeling completely safe and secure. But then, at exactly 3:21 in the morning, I woke up. I did not just drift awake. I was startled awake by a sound. It was the sound of Buster barking downstairs. And this was not his usual friendly bark. This was a loud, aggressive, vicious barking. It was the kind of sound a dog makes when they feel threatened. I will not lie to you, hearing that sound in the dead of night did scare me. It was more of a sudden surprise scare than a deep, lingering terror, but my heart was definitely racing. I threw the covers off, stood up, and made my way out of the bedroom. The entire time I was walking down the hallway and down the stairs, Buster never stopped barking. He sounded absolutely furious. I finally reached the ground floor and followed the sound of his barking into the kitchen. When I stepped into the kitchen, I saw Buster standing in front of the door that leads down to the basement. All of the hair on his back was standing completely straight up. He was incredibly tense, his muscles were locked, and he looked absolutely terrified of whatever was on the other side of that door. I walked over to him, calling his name in a quiet, soothing voice. I tried to pet him and calm him down, but he completely ignored me. He just kept staring at the basement door, barking and growling. At this point, I decided I had to figure out what was going on. I reached out and grabbed the brass doorknob. The second my hand touched the metal, Buster went into a complete spiral. He started running back and forth across the kitchen floor, barking hysterically, looking like he was going completely insane. Of course, my very first logical thought was that there was an intruder in the basement. It was possible, but honestly, it was highly unlikely. Steve has a state-of-the-art home security system with motion sensors and cameras everywhere. Breaking into his house is not an easy task. Still, I was not going to take any chances. I turned around, grabbed a large, heavy kitchen knife from the wooden block on the counter, and walked back to the basement door. I turned the brass knob and pulled the door open. Buster immediately ran to the open doorway, but he refused to cross the threshold. He stood right at the frame, his body shaking, growling deeply, his hair still sticking straight up. I reached inside the door and flipped the light switch, illuminating the wooden stairs leading down into the darkness. I started descending the stairs, yelling a bunch of angry threats into the basement, pretending to be a lot tougher and more intimidating than I actually felt. But as I reached the bottom of the stairs, I heard absolutely nothing. I saw nothing. I stood there in the middle of the finished basement and looked around. I called out to Buster, trying to get him to come down and join me, but he would not budge. He just stood at the top of the stairs, staring down at me and whining. To give myself some peace of mind, I decided to do a thorough search of the entire basement. It is a fully finished space, so there were plenty of places to check. I opened the closets, I looked in every single corner, I searched behind the large leather furniture, and I even opened the door to the small bathroom down there. There was absolutely no one there. No intruders, and certainly no evil ghosts. But the only thing I did notice that was incredibly strange was how unreasonably cold it was down there. I know it is a basement, and basements are naturally cooler than the rest of the house. But I have been in Steve's basement a million times before, and it was never this cold. It felt like a commercial freezer. Even in the dead of winter, the temperature down there had never dropped like this. But at the end of the day, a cold basement is not a logical reason to panic and run away. I figured the central heating unit was just acting up. I decided to spend the rest of the night sleeping on the couch in the living room. It took a while, but Buster eventually calmed down. He curled up on the rug next to the couch, and we both finally fell asleep again. The next day, Saturday, was completely normal. Buster was totally fine, acting like his usual happy self. We played fetch in the large backyard for a couple of hours, and I spent most of the afternoon watching movies and listening to music. At one point during the day, I went down into the basement to grab a cold soda from the mini fridge. When I stepped down there, the temperature was completely normal. It felt exactly like the rest of the house. I did not give it much thought, assuming the heating system had simply corrected itself, and I went about the rest of my day. That night, I decided to sleep on the living room couch again. I wanted to be close to the kitchen, just in case Buster had another incident with the basement door. I wanted to stay awake late, but I ended up falling asleep while watching a movie on the television. Once again, at almost the exact same time, around 3:20 in the morning, I was violently jolted awake. Buster was throwing an absolute fit, barking and growling like the house was actively on fire. I quickly got off the couch and stormed into the kitchen. I tried to get Buster to stop barking, but he completely ignored me for the second night in a row. But this night was different. I did not think it was possible, but Buster was even more erratic and terrified than he had been the night before. I kept telling him that everything was okay, trying to reassure him, but it was like I was not even in the room. When I stepped forward and grabbed the basement doorknob this time, something bizarre happened. Instead of continuing his aggressive barking, Buster immediately stopped. He let out a low, pathetic cry and began to whimper. He looked up at me with absolute dread in his eyes. It was the strangest, most heartbreaking thing to see. I let go of the knob, and when I tried to kneel down and console him, he immediately started barking furiously at the door again. I was getting incredibly annoyed and deeply confused. I grabbed the knob one last time, turned it, and pushed the door open. Once again, Buster let out a whimpering cry and refused to follow me down. This time the basement was different. It was freezing cold down there, just like the night before. But there was also a horrific smell. I do not even know how to describe it. It was a putrid, heavy, suffocating odor. It smelled like a combination of rotting garbage and wet, stagnant earth. But perhaps the weirdest and most disturbing thing was what I saw when I looked around the room. Several of the framed family pictures that Steve had hanging on the basement wall had been knocked over. They were lying face down on the floor. Additionally, the heavy bar stools by the wet bar had also been knocked completely to the ground. Aside from those items, absolutely nothing else in the basement was misplaced or destroyed. I walked over, picked up the bar stools, picked up the framed pictures, and carefully set them on top of the bar. The horrible smell was so overbearing and nauseating that I did not want to spend another second down there. I quickly walked back up the stairs and closed the door behind me. For the first 30 minutes or so, Buster continued to bark at the door while I sat at the kitchen table, trying to figure out what could possibly be causing that awful smell. When Buster finally calmed down, I gave him a dog treat, and we both went back to the living room and fell asleep. When I woke up on Sunday morning, I immediately went to the kitchen and opened the basement door, determined to find the source of that terrible odor. But when I stepped down, the smell was completely gone. There was not even a lingering hint of it in the air. Furthermore, the temperature was completely normal again. And to make things even more confusing, Buster happily followed me down the stairs this time. He was wagging his tail, sniffing around, without a single care in the world. For 2 consecutive nights, this dog had refused to step foot in this basement, acting absolutely terrified. But now, in the daylight, he was totally fine. I was completely stumped. I had no logical explanation for what had occurred over the last 2 nights. Steve and Sarah finally got home around 1 o'clock in the morning on Monday. As you might expect, Buster was jumping for joy, incredibly excited to see his owners. Sarah took Buster outside to go to the bathroom, and I stayed inside to catch up with Steve for a bit. He asked me how the weekend went, and I told him that, for the most part, everything was great. Steve gave me a very confused look when I said, "for the most part," so I decided to sit him down and explain in vivid detail everything that had happened over the weekend. I fully expected him to burst out laughing and assume I was playing a massive elaborate joke on him. But he did not laugh. He did not even smile. He just stood there, staring at me, his face turning incredibly pale. He finally looked down at the floor and spoke in a very quiet voice. He told me that when Buster was a puppy, he used to have these exact same barking fits. He would stand at that exact basement door, barking and growling hysterically in the middle of the night. Steve said it had been years since Buster had done that, so he had completely forgotten about it. They had never figured out what was causing the dog to act that way, and then one night, the behavior just stopped. I could tell that Steve was deeply freaked out by this. Honestly, a lot more freaked out than I was. We talked about it for a little while longer, but ultimately, I tried to brush it off. I kept telling him not to worry, and that it was probably just some strange coincidence. It has been 2 weeks now, and I have not been able to stop thinking about it. Steve told me that since they have been back, Buster has been completely normal. He has not had a single incident at the basement door. I have spent hours researching online, trying to find some kind of logical, scientific explanation for the cold temperature, the sudden horrific smell, and the dog's terrified behavior. But every time I think I have found a theory that makes sense, the pieces do not fit. So, what is the deal? Can anyone out there explain to me why Buster was acting that way? What was that awful smell, and where did it go? I need help, because I am actively losing sleep over this, and I do not even live in that house. I just want some sort of answer. I do not know if this is considered a typical scary story, but it is definitely freaky and incredibly unnerving. the more time that passes, the scarier it becomes to me. I wanted to share it to see if anyone has any ideas. Now, as incredibly unsettling as Ryan's experience in the basement was, it is unfortunately not the only time someone has had their sense of safety completely shattered by the unexplained. This next story happened a few years ago to a young woman named Jessica, and it is easily one of the most terrifying situations she has ever lived through. Jessica recently stopped telling people about this because whenever she did, people would accuse her of lying or making up a ghost story. But her family eventually convinced her to write it down, hoping that someone else who had gone through a similar nightmare might see it and offer some comfort. A few years ago, Jessica had just gone through a difficult breakup with her long-term boyfriend. She decided she needed a fresh start, so she moved into a cute, charming little apartment complex. The complex itself was beautiful, quiet, and very elegant. It had a wonderful, tight-knit community feel to it. Jessica quickly made friends with her immediate neighbors and several other tenants in the building. It was just a genuinely nice, friendly place to live, and she finally felt like she was getting her life back on track. A few months into her lease, Jessica was in her apartment getting ready for bed late one night. As she was brushing her teeth, she thought she heard the faint sound of someone running down the hallway outside her front door. She walked over to the door, stood on her tiptoes, and looked through the peephole. The hallway was completely empty. Since there were no children living in her specific building, she could not imagine who would be running down the hallway at that hour of the night. But she figured it was just someone in a hurry, so she did not think much of it. Over the next few nights, however, she heard the exact same running sound again. She did not bother getting up to look through the peephole because it just did not seem important enough to interrupt her evening routine. It is worth noting that Jessica's apartment was located on the ground level of the building, and her bedroom windows faced a very beautiful, manicured courtyard. Her front door, however, opened up to the interior hallway of the building, which was secure. You needed a physical key to get past the main entrance of the building. Because her bedroom windows were on the ground floor, she had to get used to the fact that someone could walk right up to her window if they wanted to. At first, she was a little self-conscious about this, but she quickly realized that the community was incredibly safe and friendly, so she stopped worrying about it. But that detail is about to become very important. One night, Jessica was fast asleep in her bed when she was suddenly awakened by a sound. It sounded like light, high-pitched giggling coming from directly outside her bedroom window. It was incredibly weird, but she immediately assumed that some local teenagers were just acting stupid and hanging out too close to her window. She sat up in bed, leaned over, tapped firmly on the window glass, and made a loud shushing noise. The giggling stopped instantly, but then, just a second later, a very faint, deliberate tapping sound could be heard on the other side of the glass. This definitely freaked her out, but Jessica was a proud, independent woman, and she was not about to let some neighborhood kids get the satisfaction of scaring her. She composed herself, reached out, grabbed the edge of her heavy curtain, and whipped it completely open. There was absolutely no one there. She stared out into the quiet, empty courtyard. The security lights were shining, and there was no movement whatsoever. Even if some kids had been standing there, she had no idea how they could have run away and vanished that quickly without making a sound. She closed the curtain, shrugged it off, and went back to sleep, determined not to let a silly prank ruin her night. Unfortunately, this weird giggling outside her bedroom window continued for the next few nights. Jessica decided the best course of action was to simply ignore it. She had young nieces and nephews, and she knew that when you ignore kids when they are trying to play a prank on you, they eventually get bored and stop doing it. That was her plan. She figured if she stopped acknowledging the giggling, they would leave her alone, and since they had not actually damaged anything, she did not want to bother the apartment complex manager with something so trivial. About 2 days later, while Jessica was at work, she received an email from the apartment complex manager, Megan. The email was very short and direct, and it felt incredibly tense. Megan asked if Jessica could please stop by the main leasing office as soon as she got home from work. She wrote that she had something she needed to show her, and she claimed it was urgent. All day long, Jessica was incredibly stressed out. She kept worrying that her rent check had bounced, or that she had accidentally violated some rule in her lease. As soon as she got off work, she drove straight to the leasing office. When she walked inside, Megan looked incredibly serious. She asked Jessica to step into her private office, and then she locked the door behind them. Megan began speaking in a very quiet, hushed whisper. A moment later, a man named David, who worked as the night security guard for the complex, walked into the room and sat down next to Jessica. Megan explained that while David was reviewing some security camera footage from the previous night, he had come across something deeply disturbing. She turned her computer screen toward Jessica and pressed play on a video file. The footage showed the interior hallway of the building, right outside Jessica's apartment door. The timestamp on the video read 2:00 in the morning. In the grainy black and white footage, two small figures wearing dark, oversized hoodies slowly walked down the hallway and stopped directly in front of Jessica's door. They appeared to be the size of children, maybe 10 or 12 years old. They stood there, completely motionless. The scariest part was when Megan fast-forwarded the video. These two small figures did not move a single inch. For nearly 10 agonizing minutes, they stood side by side, their faces completely hidden by their hoods, standing just an inch away from Jessica's door. Right before they finally walked away, one of the small figures slowly reached out a hand, grabbed Jessica's doorknob, and tried to turn it. You could clearly see them violently shaking and jostling the doorknob, trying to force the door open, but thankfully, the lock held. After a few moments, the two figures let go of the knob, turned around, and skipped playfully away, disappearing out of the camera's view. Jessica felt a wave of absolute horror wash over her. Whoever these kids were, they were actively targeting her apartment. She immediately told Megan and David about the giggling and tapping at her bedroom window, but when David went back and checked the outdoor courtyard footage from those nights, the cameras showed absolutely nothing. They decided to call the police, and an officer came out to take a statement from Jessica. The officer was polite, but he ultimately told her that unless something else happened, there was really nothing the police could do. David, the security guard, tried to trace where the two figures had gone after they skipped away from Jessica's door, but it was like they had completely vanished into thin air. He checked every single camera on the entire apartment property, and he could not find a single trace of them leaving the building or walking through the parking lot. The next night, Jessica decided she was going to stay awake. She was determined to catch these kids in the act. But that night, the hallway was dead silent. There was no giggling, no tapping, and no sounds from the corridor. About a week went by without any incidents, and Jessica finally started to let her guard down. But then, at around 1:30 in the morning, she heard a sound coming from the hallway. She immediately muted her television and sat perfectly still, listening intently. She heard the distinct, unmistakable sound of her heavy metal doorknob rattling. It was happening again. The kids were back at her door. Jessica felt a rush of adrenaline. She ran over to the front door, stood close to it, and yelled as loudly as she could for them to get away from her door. But instead of running away, she heard a child let out a soft, chilling laugh. Then a quiet, whispered child's voice came from the other side of the wood. The voice whispered, "Mom, we are home. Just open the door and let us in." Jessica stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. She did not say a word. She slowly leaned forward and pressed her eye against the peephole. Through the lens, she saw the two small, hooded figures. They were standing side by side, their heads bowed down so their faces were completely obscured. The quiet voice whispered again, "Please let us in. We are home now, please." Jessica said that the last "please" the child uttered sounded incredibly desperate and sad. But she did not care. She was terrified. She yelled through the door that their mother did not live here anymore, and that she was calling the police right now. Instead of being frightened, both of the hooded figures began to giggle. And then, the doorknob started to shake violently. One of the figures actually began throwing their entire body weight against the heavy wooden door, trying to break it down. The door shook in its frame, but the heavy deadbolt held. Jessica stood there, pressing her weight against the door, holding her breath. After a minute of intense shaking, the noise suddenly stopped. There was no more laughing, and the doorknob was completely still. She waited a moment, then peeked through the peephole one last time. The hallway was completely empty. She was still far too afraid to actually open the door, fearing they might be hiding just out of her line of sight. She immediately called the police, and 2 officers arrived a short time later. They searched the building and the surrounding property, but they found absolutely no sign of the children. They told Jessica that it was likely just some local kids playing a very elaborate, sick prank on her. Jessica did not argue with them because honestly, that felt like the only logical explanation she could cling to. A few days later, Jessica was walking through the apartment parking lot when she ran in Megan, the complex manager. Megan pulled her aside, looked around to make sure no one else was listening, and asked if Jessica had experienced anything else since that terrifying night. Jessica told her that thankfully, everything had been quiet. She added that she was sure it was just some neighborhood kids playing a prank. Megan made a very strange, uncomfortable face. She looked at Jessica and whispered that she was not so sure it was a prank. Megan explained that the woman who had lived in Jessica's apartment before her was a very strange, deeply troubled person. Megan said she could not share too much information due to privacy laws, but she was fairly confident that something truly horrible had happened to that woman's children. Megan refused to elaborate, and she would not give Jessica any names or details. She just kept repeating that something awful had occurred, and then she walked away, leaving Jessica standing there in shock. Right before Megan walked away, she looked back and said, "I am telling you, Jessica, that was not a prank." To Jessica's knowledge, those kids never visited her apartment again. She eventually moved out of the complex when her lease was up, but she has spent years trying to figure out what actually happened. Was the manager implying that those hooded figures were the ghosts of the previous tenants' children? Jessica knows that sounds completely insane, and she still refuses to believe in ghosts, but she cannot shake how incredibly strange the whole situation was. There was absolutely no way for those kids to get inside the locked building without a key, and yet, there they were, standing outside her door, whispering for their mother. Where did they come from, and where did they go? As the years go by, the memories only feel more terrifying, and Jessica is still searching for answers. If you think that is terrifying, wait until you hear about what happened to a man named Marcus. His experience shows just how quickly a harmless, playful game can turn into a living nightmare. This story happened about 10 years ago, and Marcus still gets chills down his spine whenever he thinks about it. Back then, Marcus was working a pretty standard, mundane retail job. Like most people in their early 20s, he was just trying to make ends meet. The daily drag of retail work was starting to drain the life out of him, and he found himself going through the motions every single day. But one afternoon, when Marcus was walking out to his car after an exhausting shift, he noticed something bright neon pink stuck to his driver's side door handle. He walked over and saw that it was a sticky note with a message written in neat, friendly handwriting. The note simply said, "You are special, and I hope you have an amazing day." There was also a little yellow smiley face sticker attached to the bottom of the note. Marcus smiled. He thought it was a very sweet, harmless gesture. He figured it was just someone trying to spread some positivity in the world. So he put the note in his pocket and did not think much else about it. But the next day when he left work, there was another neon pink note in the exact same spot. And the day after that, there was another one. All of them had incredibly sweet, encouraging messages on them. Now, I know some people would find this incredibly creepy, but at that point in his life, Marcus was not getting a lot of positive attention from anyone. He actually started to look forward to these notes. It felt nice to be seen, and it gave him a little boost of confidence during his long, boring shifts. After receiving 4 of these friendly notes, Marcus decided he was going to play along. When he parked his car for work the next morning, he grabbed a pad of sticky notes from his glove box and wrote his own message. He kept things friendly, but he also decided to walk that fine line of being a little bit flirtatious. He stuck the note to his own door handle and walked into work. When his shift ended that afternoon, he walked out to his car and was thrilled to find a new pink note waiting for him. His flirtatious message had worked, because this mystery person started flirting right back. Marcus did not know if this was just a harmless joke, or if this person was actually serious, but either way, he kept the playful back and forth going for several days, On the day before Marcus was scheduled to have a day off, he left a note that said something along the lines of, "Do not miss me too much on my day off tomorrow." When he left work that afternoon, he found a pink sticky note that simply had a sad face drawn on it. Marcus smiled and figured that would be the end of the game for a while. He assumed that since he was going to be home for the next couple of days, the game would naturally fizzle out, and that would be that. But he could not have been more wrong. The next morning, Marcus woke up and spent some time doing chores around his house. It was late morning when he finally decided to step outside to grab his mail. As he walked down his driveway, he froze there. Stuck to the driver's side door of his car, which was parked in his own private driveway, was a bright neon pink sticky note. Marcus felt a cold pit form in his stomach. He slowly walked over to the car, his heart beginning to race. He reached out and pulled the note off the handle. Written on the note were the words, "You look cute when you are sleeping." Marcus felt an immediate wave of intense fear. This was no longer a fun, harmless game. He lived several miles away from the store where he worked, and he had never told any of his coworkers where his house was located. He realized with absolute certainty that whoever had been leaving these notes had followed him home from work. After sitting inside his house for a couple of hours, trying to calm down, Marcus tried to rationalize the situation. He concluded that it had to be a coworker who was simply playing a very elaborate, albeit highly inappropriate, prank on him. It was the only thing that made logical sense. He crumpled the note up, threw it in the trash, and tried to forget about it. When Marcus returned to work a couple of days later, the pink notes continued. But Marcus was no longer playing along. He stopped leaving notes of his own, hoping that his lack of response would signal to this person that the game was officially over. But by the third day of his silence, the tone of the notes completely shifted. The friendly, sweet messages were gone. Instead, they started to get incredibly mean and aggressive. The pink notes were now saying things like, "You better answer me, and remember, I know exactly where you live." At this point, Marcus seriously considered calling the police, but he was still convinced that it was just a coworker trying to scare him, and he did not want to cause a massive scene at his job if it was just a stupid prank. He decided to leave one final note on his car door the next morning. He wrote a very firm, direct message that said, "Leave me alone, or I am calling the police immediately." Marcus did not actually want to involve the police, but he hoped that threatening to do so would force this person to finally stop. When he left work that afternoon, Marcus was relieved to see that his note was gone, and there was no new pink note waiting for him. For the first time in a week, his car door was completely clean. He felt a massive wave of relief wash over him. He still wanted to know who had been doing it, but as long as the notes stopped, he was perfectly happy to let it go. That night, however, Marcus woke up in the middle of the night. He was incredibly on edge ever since the note at his house, and every little sound was putting him on alert. He sat up in bed, keeping completely silent, trying to listen to the darkness. And then he heard it again. It was a very faint, subtle shuffling sound coming from the living room. It was incredibly difficult to tell if it was just the old wooden house settling, or if there was actually someone moving around out there. Marcus wanted to believe it was just his imagination, but he was not about to take any chances. He slowly slid out of bed, reached into his closet, and grabbed a heavy metal baseball bat. He opened his bedroom door and began making his way down the long, dark hallway that led to the open-concept living room and kitchen. With every single step he took, his mind raced with the worst possible scenarios. He realized that if there actually was an intruder standing in his living room, he did not know if he would actually have the courage to hit them with the bat. He was just not a violent person. He finally reached the very end of the hallway and stopped. Whatever sudden burst of bravery had gotten him out of bed was completely gone. From the edge of the hallway, he could see the entire living room, the dining area, and the kitchen. He reached out and flipped the switch for the dimmable living room lights, casting a low, warm glow over the space. Marcus scanned the entire area from where he was standing, too terrified to take another step forward. He kept imagining someone suddenly jumping out from behind the couch or lunging at him from the kitchen. He stood there in absolute silence for what felt like an eternity, but he heard nothing. The house was completely still. He finally convinced himself that he was just being paranoid. He turned the lights back off, quickly walked back to his bedroom and locked the door behind him. He turned on his television to drown out the silence, and he eventually managed to fall back asleep. But when Marcus woke up the next morning, he walked into the kitchen to grab some orange juice from the refrigerator. As he approached the fridge, he froze. Stuck directly to the stainless steel door of his refrigerator was a bright neon pink sticky note. The note said, "You can't keep me away." And right below the words was that same yellow smiley face sticker. Marcus stood there, completely paralyzed with fear for about 30 seconds. He felt a cold sweat break out across his skin. He dropped his glass, ran around the house, and checked every single door and window. To his absolute horror, every single lock was still completely engaged. Every window was shut tight, and both the front and back doors were locked from the inside. Marcus knew for an absolute fact that no one had a spare key to his house. His family lived several states away, and he did not have any close friends in the area that he trusted with a key. Somehow, this person had managed to get inside his locked home while he was sleeping, walk into his kitchen, leave a note on his fridge, and leave without making a sound. Marcus was done playing games. He immediately called the police and explained the entire situation. The officers came out, took a report, and claimed they would conduct a thorough investigation. But they also told him that without any physical evidence or signs of forced entry, there was very little they could actually do. They tried to review the security cameras in the parking lot of the store where Marcus worked, but Marcus always parked his car in the designated employee parking spaces on the side of the building. It turned out that the store's security cameras did not reach that specific area at all. The police officers concluded that the stalker had to be someone Marcus knew personally, someone who had somehow managed to copy his house key. Marcus wanted to agree with them, but he knew that was impossible. He never let his keys out of his sight. Too terrified to sleep in his own home, Marcus stayed at a friend's house for the next couple of nights. While he was there, his friend helped him buy brand new, high-security deadbolts for all of his doors. They went over to Marcus's house, installed the new locks, and his friend agreed to stay over with him for the first night back. Nothing happened that night, and as the weeks turned into months, the notes completely stopped. There were no new pink notes at work, and his house remained completely secure. Marcus finally started to feel safe again. But then, over 2 months later, Marcus walked out of his front door to head to work. And there, stuck directly to the middle of his front door, was a single neon pink sticky note. Marcus felt his heart sink. He walked over, grabbed the note, and read the words. It said, "I guess you don't want to play anymore." Marcus immediately called the police again, but once again, they could do very little. After that day, Marcus decided to invest in a high-end security camera system for his home. But thankfully, nothing ever happened again. Looking back on that entire nightmare, Marcus still gets physically ill. He realizes now that changing the locks on his doors might have genuinely saved his life. It is the only thing that makes sense. This stalker must have somehow acquired a key to his original locks. But what terrifies Marcus the most is thinking back to the night he heard those shuffling noises in his living room. He realizes now that there was almost certainly a person hiding somewhere in the dark, just feet away from where he was standing with that baseball bat. Why didn't they attack him? Did they just want to play a sick, psychological game with him? Marcus's friend once suggested that when Marcus ran back to his bedroom and locked the door, that simple action of locking his bedroom door might have been the only thing that kept the intruder from coming in and hurting him. It has been 10 years since that last note was left on his door. Marcus has since moved to a completely different state, and he is happily married now. But to this day, whenever he sees a pad of neon pink sticky notes in an office supply store, he is instantly flooded with the terrifying memories of those uninvited guests. He is just incredibly grateful that he survived to tell the story. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.